Opticians are the focus of Alf's attention when the Garnets return at the same time next Sunday.
Tomorrow on BBC1, the most controversial true crime story of recent years, Fatal Vision. They called him the Golden Boy. Jeff MacDonald seemed destined to have it all. A model Green Beret officer and a respected doctor. The perfect father and the perfect husband. It was the happiest time Jeff MacDonald and his wife Colette would ever know. But it all ended one night, the night MacDonald witnessed his family's massacre. The vision he will never be allowed to forget. The crime that captured a nation's attention. The murder the Golden Boy will be accused of committing.
You're sitting there telling me that I killed my wife and kids. I think so.
The army is charging Jeff with 3 counts of murder.
This is the most asinine thing I've ever heard. Why? I ask you, why?
Jeff's father-in-law will be one of his strongest advocates.
If I ever had another daughter, I'd still want the same son-in-law.
But he will have to face the question he's afraid to have answered. Could the man who murdered his daughter be the same man who married her?
I didn't kill Colette. I didn't kill Kimmy. I didn't kill Kristen.
Fatal Vision begins tomorrow on BBC1.
BBC Two's film starting shortly is The Group, an adaptation of Mary McCarthy's novel and starring Candice Bergen and Joan Hackett. Here on 1 in 15 minutes, David Jessel opens a new series of Heart of the Matter. First, the news with Jan Leeming.
Prison riot in Ireland. Buildings on fire as inmates go on the rampage. Financial crisis in South Africa. The government stops paying back foreign loans. Agreement at the Mirror. The presses will be rolling tomorrow night. And the little repair job that's cost $10 million. A prison riot in the Irish Republic came to an end tonight when 40 inmates decided they'd had enough and ended a rooftop sit-in after a day of violent protests. The disturbances started early this morning when about 70 prisoners held on Spike Island went on the rampage over conditions. There were running battles with police and buildings were set alight. Army reinforcements had to be sent from the mainland to the island jail in Cork Harbour. The prison was reopened earlier this year to house the growing number of young men convicted of stealing cars. From Cork, Neil Bennett reports.
Hours after the riot began, Spike Island Jail, a former British garrison, was still smouldering. At midnight, inmates had begun setting fire to dormitories and attacking prison officers. They fought running battles with the beleaguered staff and stole a mechanical digger to try to batter down the gates. They escaped from the prison, but not from the island. Eventually, reinforcements arrived to restore order, an operation which took far too long, according to prison officers. 40 inmates then retreated to the roof and stayed there for most of the day, periodically shouting out their demands.
One is to be brought back to our own prisons where we came from. 2, that we lose no remission. And 3, that no charges will be pressed against us.
But the Irish government, already under fierce attack over law and order, didn't flinch.
The priority is that none of these people who were involved in this situation, this affair last night, are going to get any remission off their sentence. And they're not going to be put back to the prison of their choice. They're going to serve their sentences right to the full. They'll get their statutory remission like anybody else, but nothing else.
2 prisoners were brought ashore for medical treatment, and tonight the men on the roof came down quietly. But the government faces renewed criticism that warnings about lax security on the island were ignored.
The South African government tonight suspended repayments on its foreign debts until the end of the year. The country's finance minister said the move was necessary because foreign bankers were refusing to reschedule short-term loans. It comes on another day of violence when for the first time whites were deliberately killed. From Johannesburg, our correspondent James Robbins reports on the day's developments.
In the midst of crisis, the foreign exchange and stock exchange were closed last Wednesday. They reopen tomorrow on the new basis announced tonight. A 2-tier exchange rate will be introduced to discourage foreign investors withdrawing more money from the country, and South Africa will make no repayments on foreign loans until the end of the year.
fact that we now have to postpone payment of the principal amounts will certainly harm our image. If we could have avoided it, we would have. But we did our homework over the last few weeks, and we came to the conclusion that it was inevitable.
The announcement coincided with the start of a strike in 7 of the country's gold and coal mines. A strike on a much lesser scale than the government once feared. But already 7 miners have been injured in clashes with management security men, at a mine not directly involved, but sympathetic to the action. Before the financial news, the white minority was already shocked by 2 brutal murders last night. 4 men, all white, were in a car which was stoned and forced off the road after meeting a crowd of blacks walking home from a mass funeral in East London. If an argument developed isn't clear, but 3 of the men were pulled out of the car and stabbed repeatedly. 1 died, the others were seriously injured. The 4th was trapped inside when the crowd set the vehicle alight, and he was burned to death.
The British businessman freed yesterday after a year in a Nigerian jail without trial has arrived back home. Graham Coviduck from Hampshire disclosed that when he was arrested, he'd been investigating fraud on behalf of the Nigerian Security Police, the very people who arrested him.
His year in a notorious Nigerian jail had reduced the once burly businessman to a modest 12 stone. His wife admitted she was shocked when she saw him. Graham Coviduck contracted dysentery and malaria and went on hunger strike to protest at his conditions in Kirikiri prison. Charges of extortion against him were dropped, and he said he owed his release to the new military regime who'd taken over after Nigeria's recent coup. Back to freedom and champagne, he put a brave face on his ordeal.
It was mainly a problem of getting medicines and adequate food. Our food requirements are very much different than the Nigerians' food requirements, and it took time to get the food supply organised so that we had a reasonable diet.
Your conditions have been described as appalling. Is that true?
They weren't good.
Can you say how big your cell was?
About 10 foot by 8 foot.
And how many did you share that with?
Varied between 6 and 9.
I quite honestly didn't recognise him, and I was looking round the corner for somebody else to come in, but I'm getting used to the new image now.
Because he lost so much weight.
Yes, that's right, yes. What did he weigh before?
What was his original weight?
I really can't remember now, but he must have lost 6 or 7 stone, I should think.
Well-wishers provided a cake to mark his return. It was a triple celebration: his wife's birthday and the couple's 12th wedding anniversary.
The dispute that stopped production of Robert Maxwell's Mirror and his other newspapers has been settled. Mr. Maxwell has withdrawn his letter sacking all 4,500 Mirror printing employees. The Mirror will be back on Tuesday, and the Sunday Mirror and People back next Sunday. From Blackpool, John Fryer reports.
The print workers' leader said Mr. Maxwell had to make the first move. They were ready to negotiate if he was. But the letter sacking all 4,500 Mirror staff, some within 7 days, didn't make things any easier. Mr. Maxwell was apparently ready for a long stay here in Blackpool. Up on the first floor of the Imperial Hotel, he was keen to be seen making the running. Downstairs, other print union leaders waited anxiously to learn what had happened and were standing by for an emergency meeting of the TUC Printing Committee. Then came news that a deal had been struck. Under it, the loss-making racing newspaper The Sporting Life, which was at the centre of the dispute, will no longer be produced in Fleet Street. Whether this deal will stick remains to be seen. Much will still depend on whether the printers actually involved in Fleet Street accept it.
We have reached an agreement with Mr. Maxwell tonight, which we will be recommending to our members in London tomorrow for the simultaneous production tomorrow night of the Mirror Group titles in London. And we hope, therefore, that that will resolve this current dispute.
Mr. Maxwell had said the Mirror would never be printed in Fleet Street again. He's withdrawn that, but his paper will be back on Tuesday.
I've been sadly missed. We shall be as glad to be back as our readers will be glad to see us back.
Also in Blackpool, the General Secretary of the TUC, Norman Willis, said its conference this year would be a landmark on the road to a fairer Britain. But he conceded that it faced some very knotty problems, as our industrial editor Martin Aidney reports.
The TUC Congress began to convene in Blackpool today, its prospects as uncertain as the weather. Its leaders feel the opinion polls show the Labour movement on the march again. But as preparations for the conference went ahead, two winds of dissension threatened. A row over committing the Labour movement to repaying the miners' union all the money it's lost through fines and sequestration. And the unresolved question of whether to suspend the engineering workers.
Well, tonight, the row over the engineers taking government money for their ballots looks like getting worse. What they'd like to do is to go to a fresh ballot or a fresh meeting of their policy committee. But increasingly it's being said here that that won't do. Unless they recant rapidly, they could be slung out of the conference by the end of the week.
For TUC General Secretary Norman Willis, attending the traditional pensioners' rally, it could prove to be a long week.
It seems certain that Cecil Parkinson will stay on the back benches if, as expected, Mrs Thatcher announces her cabinet reshuffle tomorrow. Today in Manchester, the Energy Secretary Peter Walker said the party must appeal to the young if it's to win the next election.
The cabinet changes are set to be announced tomorrow, and as Mrs Thatcher returns to Downing Street from Chequers late tonight, she'll be aware that Mr Walker's message echoes the calls from other MPs for her to use this reshuffle to enable the government to project a more positive image. Norman Tebbit is the strong favourite to take over from John Gummer in the key post of party chairman. He's apparently recovered well after the Brighton bomb, although there are those who say his style is too abrasive. This, in theory, would have allowed Mrs Thatcher to bring Cecil Parkinson into the cabinet as Trade and Industry Secretary. She certainly wanted him back, but party pressure has blocked his rehabilitation. If this is to be a bold reshuffle, some space will have to be made at the cabinet table. Patrick Jenkin, the Environment Secretary, has had a difficult year and could go, as could Michael Jopling, who's had a torrid time at Agriculture, and Peter Rees, the Treasury Chief Secretary, who seems to have been everyone's tip for the sack. His replacement is likely to be either John Moore, currently Financial Secretary, or Paul Channon, the Trade Minister, who's coming up fast on the rails. Kenneth Baker, Local Government Minister and conqueror of the GLC, is tipped for promotion, as is Kenneth Clarke, who is impressed as Health Minister. Malcolm Rifkin from the Foreign Office makes up this trio of rising stars. In another change, Tom King, the Employment Secretary, and Lord Young, who has special responsibility for jobs, will have their duties redefined. Finally, the millionaire author Geoffrey Archer, who's a former Tory MP, could be given a job at party headquarters, presumably in an attempt to give their message the bestseller touch. The rumours over the cabinet reshuffle have gone on for several months now, and many Conservative MPs will welcome an early end to the uncertainty, so the party can try to reverse its recent poor showings in the opinion polls as soon as possible.
The driver of the French train, which crashed yesterday killing 42 people, has been charged with manslaughter. Railway officials say he was travelling at 3 times the speed limit. The express from Paris to the Spanish border came off the rails at Argenton-sur-Creuse in central France. A northbound mail train then crashed into its coaches. A young British couple were among the dead. Rail unions say job cuts and poor training have reduced safety standards, though French railways have denied it. Off the Florida coast of the United States, Hurricane Eleanor is still gaining power with winds of over 110 miles an hour. It's the worst storm for several years, with heavy rain and violent seas causing severe damage. The hurricane's expected to hit the coastline near Cedar Key at any time, but already nearly 1 million people have been evacuated from their homes to places of safety. From the storm coast, Martin Bell reports.
Cedar Key, the nearest point on the coast to the hurricane, was battered this morning with winds gusting at 60 to 70 miles an hour, threatened with another 12 to 15 inches of rain and tides 8 feet above normal. The damage so far?
Somewhere probably between $5 and $10 million. The road's just about completely cut through at the next bridge up. We won't know until this thing's over with. It's probably one of the worst ones we've had in a many a year.
On the outskirts of the town, the police had set up roadblocks to stop people who wanted to return to their homes from trying to do so. The looting that had happened further south was unlikely to happen here.
Anywhere you go, you'll have a looting problem, but in our area, we're not faced with it like you are in the big cities.
But you're still protecting against it?
Oh, yeah, we're protecting the people's property and homes while they're gone.
Looting was unlikely anyway in conditions where it was almost impossible to stand up, where the police and the wildlife had the town to themselves, and where the only bridge into Cedar Key is likely to be washed completely away in the strengthening gales today. Elena is now reclassified as a major hurricane. For 2 days she's been undecided what to do. The fear is now she'll strike northwards to the populous Florida Panhandle. The people who live near this coast are getting impatient. For 2 days now they've been pounded by the outer edge of this storm, and the worst of it is that this isn't the worst of it yet.
2 astronauts from the American space shuttle Discovery have finished repairing a satellite which has been stranded in space for 5 months. It took 2 long spacewalks and some tricky electrical work to do the job. But if it is a success, it will put into service a satellite worth $85 million. Kathy Hunt in London has been looking at the pictures of the rescue mission.
The astronauts spent 7 hours outside the shuttle on Saturday, wrestling with the errant satellite SYNCOM-3. It's been spinning uselessly in space since April because of an electrical failure. They managed to manoeuvre it onto Discovery's robot arm and into the cargo bay. They installed new equipment, bypassing the faulty circuits. The satellite then flickered into life. Today, the astronauts successfully put the final touches to their repairs. But it'll be another 2 months before the real test. Then a signal will be sent from the ground, igniting the satellite's rocket to put it into its proper orbit. The SYNCOM satellite belongs to an American communications firm, but it's leased to the Navy. The rescue mission has cost $10 million.
And that's all from the newsroom for this weekend. From me, good night.
Good evening to you. Hurricane Elena might have dropped out of the news, but it most certainly hasn't dropped out of our thoughts, especially when you bear in mind that the winds in it are touching 115 miles an hour and they've had violent tornadoes and torrential rain. At the moment, actually, it's holding fire, but it's dangerously close to the coast of Florida. Anyhow, closer to home, we have problems of our own. We have an area of low pressure moving in towards the British Isles, and although it's nothing like a hurricane, it is going to bring wet and windy weather to many parts of the country. In fact, that rain will be getting into Northern Ireland and western parts of England and Wales before the night is out. Elsewhere, with skies clearing, it's going to end up quite a chilly night, I think. There might even be a touch of ground frost in 1 or 2 places. And then tomorrow, central and eastern areas starting off dry and bright, but that rain will already be in the west. And in fact, during the course of the morning, that rain will reach many other western parts of the country as well, and some of the rain turning out to be quite heavy. And then in the second half of the day, the rain pushing on into eastern areas, pushing on up into Scotland as well, reaching all, I think, but the far north of Scotland before the end of the afternoon, although in the evening time, somewhat clearer, but showery weather will come along to replace the rain in those more western parts. Now, tomorrow it's going to be once again on the cool side, although temperatures actually, despite the rain, a little bit up on today's, but once again in many western and southern parts, ending up to be quite a windy day. That's all for now. A very good night to you.
Now for news of tomorrow night's Panorama, here's Gavin Hewitt.
In Western Sudan, one of the biggest famine relief operations in history has failed. Despite massive shipments of grain from around the world, people are still starving less than 20 miles from warehouses full of food. Virtually the entire Sudanese transport system collapsed amid mismanagement, confusion and corruption. In the midst of this chaos, Live Aid has chosen to spend its first millions from its summer rock spectacular. Already, the idea that gripped the imagination of the world has come face to face with reality.
I don't know any people who've gone into Africa who haven't had their fingers burned one way or the other, and the people who've had their fingers most burned are the ones who are dying.
But can Live Aid stay alive in the desert wastes of Sudan? That's Live Aid's Desert Gamble. Panorama tomorrow night at 9:30.
Well, now, to begin a new series of Heart of the Matter, David Jessel looks at terrorism, asking, is it their war, our weakness?